Welcome to Tabletop Theory, where we learn about becoming a better GM with counseling and educational theory. Today, we're going to talk about one of my very favorite books. So get ready, it's time for a book report. In 2019, Sean K. Reynolds of Pathfinder fame and author Shauna Germain released the book Consent in Gaming through Monte Cook Games. The book itself is 13 pages. It's actually smaller than that because the first page is a cover and the last page is a checklist. Okay, it's an 11-page book. It's not even a book, it's a PDF. Fine, it's an 11-page PDF that you can download, but I'm still gonna call it a book. You can download the book from Monte Cook Games or from other places like DriveThruRPG, and you can even find the link in the description. I hate drawn out answers, and since this could be used as a recommendation for whether or not to get this book, let me just give you my recommendation now. Yes, I think you should get this book. But let me tell you why. So what is it? What is consent in gaming? Well, it's an introduction to the ideas of consent and self-respect and how they're both applied to RPGs. The book is organized into several sections. It opens with a description of what consent is, things like why players should have the default framework of opting into certain parts of the story, and why anyone can change their mind about what they're comfortable with at any given time. The next section moves on to how to have conversations with your players or your GM, and to operationalize consent at the table. The authors provide some suggestions for using ideas like go and no-go words, the X card, and utilizing a consent checklist. Following that, the authors share a few ideas on how to have conversations with your players or GM when someone crosses a consent boundary. The book ends with some resources for game masters to use at their table to discuss the ideas of consent, including a very useful checklist that can help players to start their own conversations with their GMs about what may and may not be okay at their tables. Now, I know I just threw out a ton of information, and it was all at once, and some of those terms might seem a little unfamiliar. It's okay though. The authors do a really good job of breaking down all of the different aspects of consent and why it can really help you as a game master. At least it helps me. Longtime viewers of this channel will probably remember that I am a huge fan of consent at the RPG table. I've made a few videos about it before because I think consent is a really important concept that helps to build trust and get the game master to write better stories. What this book does, in less than 12 pages, is distill down all of the excellent reasons why understanding and using consent can be helpful to you as a GM. When I'm a GM, I want to know what my players are looking for in a game. I also want to know what my players don't want. So when I'm running D&D for like a new group that I've never met, I really do want to know where those lines are. The authors do a really good job of explaining how to find those lines and recognize when to use them in the creation of a story, or when just running a game. They include several examples of how consent is already baked into certain games like No Thank You Evil, and how GMs can help to resolve any accidental inclusion of topics that were previously deemed off limits. Personally, I feel like this book should be required reading for anybody who's thinking about getting into the RPG hobby, but let's get back to what the book actually is, because there's one really big nugget of goodness in this book, and it's on the very last page. The RPG Consent Checklist. To me, this sheet is really valuable, and I've started using it in like almost all of my campaigns. So let's go take a quick look at it together. The sheet itself asks 4 questions and then has 6 categories of topics. The top of the sheet asks the GM and the player to put down their names, and the player doesn't even actually have to do that if they feel like they'd like to remain anonymous. The theme of the game is also requested, so this would be where the game master would put down something like desert pirate adventure, or, I don't know, gritty sci-fi pizza delivery. Then there's a section where the GM can put down a prospective rating for the game, like PG, PG-13, or R. For our British friends, the equivalent would be, I guess, U, PG, 12A, 15, and 18, but you get the idea. The real meat of the sheet, though, lies in the columned categories. These categories are horror, relationships, social and cultural issues, mental and physical health, and some blank spaces for additional topics. Each of these categories have a small but comprehensive list of several different things that players may be okay with or may not be okay with. The players can fill in one of several different colored boxes in order to indicate this. The green squares represent enthusiastic consent, so like, bring on the spiders. The yellow triangles represent sort of a tentative consent, so something like a kidnapping would probably happen off screen. And the red circles represent a lack of consent, or a hard no, such as there's not going to be any conclusion or mention of self-harm in this game. Each category has several examples that players can choose to consent or not consent to. They have some blank spots at the bottom of each category so that players can add their own things that may not be listed. Having these lines of what is and is not okay for players is really helpful. Knowing where my players will start to feel uncomfortable is a great asset for me because I can really focus on the areas my players want to spend time. Lastly, this book addresses issues that have persisted in the RPG hobby for a long time, namely namely the presence of sexism, racism, homophobia, and misogyny. These issues are baked into the very history of a lot of RPGs, so like the problematic chainmail bikinis of Clyde Caldwell in the 80s and 90s are a good example, and if you really want more examples of what the problems could be, go take a look at the unfortunate dumpster fire that is r/RPG horror stories over on Reddit. Consent in gaming isn't going to fix any of these issues on its own, like as a book, but reading it could help you understand them a little bit better. So let's have a conversation about what this book is not. This book is not the downfall of the RPG hobby as we know it. When it was released back in 2019, the authors caught a lot of undeserved heat. There was a great deal of wailing and gnashing of teeth about how thin-skinned that people have become in the RPG world. A lot of people thought this book was completely unnecessary, and a few people even thought that Shauna Germain was unqualified to write about RPGs because she'd previously written another book about consensual sex. Not quite sure how writing another book on the same topic of consent makes you less qualified to write about it, but I really don't like the idea of labeling the RPG hobby as full of misogynistic reactionaries, especially when most of the reactions to this book were on places like Reddit, where posts have about as much credibility as graffiti on a bathroom wall. But I also know that not everybody has the same reasons for objecting to it, and to why Consent in Gaming may not be a worthwhile book in their opinion. All people are different people. But the thing is, these reactions still happened, and I think I have an idea as to why. Let me draw a parallel to video games. When I was a teenage edgelord, I was very opposed to the idea of anybody putting blame on video games for their violent behavior. Every time I heard about someone blaming Halo or Mortal Kombat in the media for some real-life act of violence, I would get really defensive and probably stop listening immediately. I did this because video games were important to me, and I didn't want to see something I care about get attacked. I didn't like people pointing out the problems with something that I loved. Of course, I didn't quite see it like that. Nah, I was doing my own research by talking to people who agreed with me. My friends and I all agreed that video games never caused us any problems or made us more violent, so the problems that other people were seeing, like in the news, must not be real. Thankfully, as I grew up, I realized that this point of view was really dismissive and really short-sighted. I think the presence of this book might have done something similar to the role-playing game community. A lot of people who play RPGs know that there are problematic elements in a lot of the games that they love. But they ignore them and play them anyway because the good outweighs the bad. And I know there's a lot of problems in a game like Dungeons & Dragons, but I still think it can do a lot of good. And that's okay. Lots of things have complicated pasts. However, because some people may feel like any admission of those problems could lead to the hobby getting bad press, or just getting misunderstood in general, they have a pretty reasonable reaction to a book that's created to help address some of those problems. Part of me thinks that it's the habit of people have of like sticking their head in the sand sometimes. Like if we ignore the problem, we think it's going to go away. And if it hasn't happened to me, then the problem must not be real. The other part of me thinks that some people are uncomfortable with this idea because of discomfort with vulnerability. Sort of like if I fill in the red dot that says I'm not comfortable with something, that makes me look weak. I mean, I kind of get these arguments because I think they come from a place of discomfort and fear. When I was 14, my hormone-addled brain probably wanted to seem macho and act like nothing bothered me. 14-year-old me probably would have looked at this book and said something like, I don't need this, I can handle anything in a game. But secretly been like afraid of having any weak points publicly exposed. I was bullied a lot as a kid. I wanted to hide any crack in my armor where something could be used against me. So the idea of filling out a worksheet with the things that made me uncomfortable would have been a complete non-starter. And I'm sure there's a lot of other reasons people have for not liking this book, but those are the ones that came to mind most readily for me. Because here's the thing, saying you're afraid of spiders or just uncomfortable with things like genocide or torture doesn't make you weak. It's actually the opposite. If you do choose to use the consent checklist, it's an expression of vulnerability and drawing a personal boundary. It takes courage to be vulnerable enough to write down the things that scare you or make you uncomfortable on a sheet of paper and to trust that the person you're giving it to isn't going to use it against you. It takes even more courage to stand up to someone who crosses your boundary and say that you're not okay with that. It takes very little courage to dismiss someone's boundary or be flippant about why something like this needs to exist in the first place. Some of you might think this makes me a hypocrite, but it's my video. If you've never really been affected by a GM going too far and engaging in some really creepy behavior, even unintentionally, then you may not see a need for a book like Consent in Gaming. But people have done transgressive, mean things while playing RPGs before, and the people who it happened to probably see the need for this book. The authors don't blame or shame people for past transgressions because what would be the point? Those things have already happened and they can't be changed. Consent in gaming simply gives GMs today a chance to do something differently and try to do it better in the future. Consent in gaming is also not a way to learn about what your players don't like, only to use it against them in the future. If you do choose to use the checklist and you intentionally include a topic that one of your players has marked in the red, that's not just including some fear in your game to raise the stakes. That's being intentionally cruel to your players. Full stop. Don't do that. Because if someone's aware enough of themselves to know that they don't like spiders or small spaces, then that's a good thing, because they will probably try to avoid movies and games that have them. And if a GM knows that a player has those concerns, the hope is that they would do the considerate thing and not include them. That's all this book is encouraging people to do. Players and GMs can point out what they like and what they don't like. And if they want, they can fill out the checklist and maybe even have a conversation with their GM before they sit down to play. This book is also not censorship. The authors are not saying that GMs should no longer include any specific theme in their games. The idea of consent that they are promoting is only that GMs and players be sensitive to what each other are comfortable with. This book is also not just for people who are using RPGs in an educational or applied therapeutic setting. The ideas in Consent in Gaming are applicable to all tables. Lastly, this book is also not required. It doesn't need to be used in all games, and you're not a bad person if you choose not to use it, because you've got every right as a GM or a player not to use this. So, should you get it? Well, like I said in the beginning, yeah, I think this book is worth reading. Even if you don't plan to include the consent checklist in your game, the book still has a lot of really good points that I think all GMs should be aware of. Even if you don't like the idea of this book, I think you should still go read it. I don't know, if only to better understand what makes you uncomfortable about it. Other than it just being good manners to not make people feel skeeved out, the book helps GMs, new and experienced, to think about the idea of consent. If you've watched this video this far and you're still very opposed to the idea of what this book represents, I encourage you to use the consent checklist and write down that you do not want conversations about consent in your next game. Go on, fill in the red circle. You know, the book is free, literally. It costs you nothing but time to go and download and read it. In fact, it's probably going to take you less time to read than it does to watch this video. Sean and Shauna did a really good job of breaking down the idea of consent into something applicable to RPGs, and they gave it to the world for free. Because understanding consent isn't something that should be behind a paywall. So that's all I've got. Thanks so much for watching. This is the start of what I hope is going to be a fun new series where I get to talk about books that I love, and maybe even some that I don't love. Either way, if you have some ideas for books that you'd like to see me review in the future, please leave them here in the comments section, or you can hit me up on Twitter or Instagram. It's also going to mean a lot to me if you help to promote this video by hitting the like button. That actually does a lot to promote the video. If you really enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more like it, you can also consider subscribing. It's the button next to the like button, or maybe below it. And if you really liked this video and you'd like to help support the creation of more just like it, you can go become a supporter on Buy Me a Coffee for just $5 a month. The link's down in the description, and I want to thank everyone who's supported me so far, and a very special thank you to those of you who are monthly supporters. It really means the world to me, and I look forward to making more videos for you in the future. I really like the show Ted Lasso, shocker, right? If you haven't seen it, I really recommend that you go take a look at it. It's on Apple TV, I think maybe Apple TV Plus, whatever it's called. In the first season, Ted, the main character, mentions one of my favorite Walt Whitman quotes: "Be curious, not judgmental." Using a consent checklist in an RPG may seem like a silly idea because you may not think it's necessary. You may think that people who use it are thin-skinned or too sensitive. But I'd encourage you to try and remember that Walt Whitman quote: "Be curious, not judgmental." Because why do you think the authors wrote the book? Why do you think they gave it away for free? I may not know the specific answers, but I do know that when I feel like I want to judge somebody, especially when I disagree with their point of view, I try my best to be curious and examine why I feel like I need to do that. It's really easy to label somebody, but it's really hard to question ourselves and why we do that. And I hope that the next time you feel yourself snap to judgment, you're not going to be too hard on yourself, and you take a second to give yourself a chance to be curious, because it's important. Thanks for watching. Take care, be kind, and have fun adventuring.